Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success, where we are continuing your course on democracy and Nazism. Now, as we saw last lesson, some historians have called the years 1924 to 9 the years of recovery and achievement for the Weimar Republic. And they've even been given the nickname the Golden Age of the Republic. So we need to find out to what extent is that actually true. And last lesson, we looked at Stresemann's economic policies to deal with and resolve the situation of the 1923 hyperinflation crisis. But now there are further economic developments we have to consider, and also to see how far-reaching and genuine or authentic the image of economic recovery actually was. So for that, we need to really look into the nitty-gritty of the German economy and see if perhaps there were some inherent flaws that made economic recovery never truly achievable. You should also take note that another key element to prove the Golden Age is actually linked to Stresemann's foreign policy. And we are going to look what we're going to look at today, the Dawes and the Young Plan are part of Stresemann's foreign policy. Now, first of all, I just want to clear some things up regarding reparations, because any discussion of reparations and American loans is usually conducted in a swirl of figures and dates, and actually you skirt, or I find sometimes the textbooks skirt the crucial issues, which is how much did the Allies demand, how much did Germany actually pay, and what form did the reparations take? It's these three questions which I'm going to now go into more detail for. So in answer to the first question then, how much, the amount demanded? Well, this actually varied considerably across the years. And during Versailles, the principal compensation was established, but no actual sum was fixed. Okay, so there was no sum fixed at Versailles. In 1921, the sum to be paid was fixed at 226,000 million gold marks, payable over 42 years. In April 1921, the total was actually reduced to 6.6 billion pounds, and this was arranged at 50,000 million marks plus 6% interest to be paid over 50 years, followed by a second phase payment of 82,000 million marks. The annual payments were estimated to be about 7% of Germany's national income. In 1924 and in 1929, reparations were reorganized by the Dawes Plan and then the Young Plan, and we'll look into more detail of that in a minute. And in 1931, payments were suspended for 1 year as part of a general moratorium on debts. And the next year at the Lausanne conference, agreement was reached at a final payment of 3,000 million marks to be paid in a one-off payment in 1935. And this was actually never paid. So looking at the second question then, how much did Germany actually pay? Overall, it's been estimated that Germany actually only paid 1/8 of the original sum. Following the Dawes Plan, Germany actually received more in loans than it paid in reparations. And this appears generous, but do remember that whereas reparations were permanent losses to Germany, American loans to Germany also had to be repaid. Between 1924 and 1950, Germany received 135 long-term loans totaling $1,430 million, plus short-term loans, which totals $1,560 million, and all payments were suspended in 1932. So what form did reparations take? Well, they took the form, firstly, of payments in kind, for example, coal and manufactured products, and money from, we've got manufactured products there, and money from, in the form of gold, but not paper money. The German government bought the materials from German manufacturers and gave them to 9 foreign governments, primarily France, which got 50% of the total, and then Britain, Italy, and Belgium as well. As payments were not in paper money, inflation didn't reduce the real burden, and we've already addressed that in earlier lessons. The Allied governments received the products and money and kept some for their own use, including paying compensation to those who had been harmed during the war, e.g. via war pensions. But also they paid back some of their loans to the USA. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the Dawes Plan of 1924. Well, the starting point of Stresemann's foreign policy was the issue of reparations. And as Chancellor, he'd called off passive resistance and agreed to resume the payment of reparations. The stabilization of Germany's economy was as much dependent on settling the reparations dispute as it was on domestic issues. And in November 1923, he actually asked the Allies' Reparations Committee to set up a committee of financial experts to address Germany's repayment concerns. The USA had a vested interest in getting Germany back to a position where reparations could be made to France, because much of this money was then passed on to the USA to repay the loans. Therefore, the American banker Charles Dawes acted as the new committee's chairman. And by the time the Dawes Plan was finalized in April 1924, Stresemann's government had actually fallen, but he remained as foreign secretary. And so he took credit actually for much of what was achieved. So the plan itself, well, it included the acceptance of the reorganization of the German currency. So as we already mentioned last lesson, one new Rentenmark was to be worth 1 trillion of the old marks. The setting up of a German national bank, the Reichsbank, under Allied supervision. Secondly, an international loan of 800 million gold marks was given to aid Germany's economic recovery. The loan was to be financed mainly by the USA and would help allow for investment in German infrastructure. Loans from the USA came from both the government and private investors and aided programs such as municipal housing. Also, 79 American firms established factories in Germany, including those like General Motors and General Electronics. And thirdly, new arrangements for the payment of reparations was made. Payment was to be made annually at a fixed scale over a longer period. It would pay 1,000 million marks, and this would increase by 2,500 million marks per year over 5 years. And after this, payments would be linked to German industrial performance. And also, the amount paid by Germany would be reduced until 1929, when the situation would be reappraised. So they would re-look at the figures and see where Germany's payments should be. You should also take note here that although the total reparations were confirmed at the original figure of £6.6 billion, so they're not actually getting a reduced amount overall, the payments were actually far more manageable because they were lessening the payments over the course of the years. So it's giving Germany a chance to pay that money back and being more realistic about it. So why did the USA and its allies put forward this plan through the Reparations Committee? Why would it support something like this? Well, first of all, the USA gained economically through interest on loans and profits from business. It also had a vested interest, as I've already mentioned, in Germany repaying France, as they were indebted to the US after the war. So you can see behind me the triangle. You've got the USA giving loans to Germany. Germany then is using those loans to pay reparations to Britain and France, and then Britain and France can then use those reparations to repay the USA for its war debts. So how would Germany see the Dawes plans? What would be the reaction from the German people? Well, in terms of advantages, for Stresemann it was, and he saw the many advantages. For the first time since World War I, Germany's economic problems received international recognition. The Allies accepted Germany's problems in paying reparations were actually real. They weren't doubting them. They weren't being suspicious about it. Secondly, Germany gained credit for the cash-starved German economy by means of the loans and subsequent investments. The loans helped to restart the German economy and provided houses, jobs, machinery, all going back into the cycle of the economy and building it up slowly. Now, this was actually seen by Stresemann as an economic armistice, but still necessary for the economic benefits it brought. And finally, the French left the Ruhr in 1924-5 as reparations began again. And this restored some German optimism that their country was once again its own master. So overall then, in the short term, the Dawes Plan was really a success. The German economy wasn't weakened since it received twice as much capital from abroad as it paid out in reparations. Also, the mere fact that the reparations were being paid regularly contributed to the improved relations between France and Germany during these years. However, of course, there's the other side, and there's always going to be disadvantages. And I must stress that this would actually primarily come from the viewpoint of the Nazis and the DMVP and other right-wing groups. And so there was heated debate in the Reichstag about the plan and whether or not to accept it. And the so-called national opposition bitterly attacked the policy of compromise, since they believed that Germany should actually defy the unjust Versailles Treaty altogether and refuse to pay reparations at all. Pointedly, also, the long-term effects were more ominous. So we have a short-term benefit, but in the long term, slightly more precarious and dangerous. Because as you can see in the diagram behind me, if we go back to what I showed you earlier, the whole system is dangerously dependent on one thing, and that is the continuation of American loans. So in attempting to break out of the crisis in 1923, Stresemann has actually linked Germany's fortunes to powerful external forces, which had dramatic effects after 1929, when we'll look at the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. Now, 1929 was a significant year in terms of the German economy and political situation, because it was the year that the Dawes Plan was due to be reviewed after its 5 years. And the Dawes Plan, was only actually ever meant to be a temporary settlement of the reparations issue. And although the French and Belgians left the Ruhr by 1925, Allied forces actually remained in occupation of the Rhineland, and the French wouldn't agree to withdraw these forces unless and until a final settlement of the reparations issue had been agreed. Therefore, Stresemann, who had continued to serve as foreign minister after his own coalition government collapsed, agreed that the issue should be considered by an international committee headed by the American businessman Owen Young. And this committee met in Paris in 1929 with Hallmark as one of Germany's representatives, and produced a report on the final settlement of the reparations issue. Now, the Young Plan obliged Germany to continue paying reparations until 1988. The total reparations bill was considerably reduced, and Germany being required to pay £1.8 billion instead of £6.6 billion. But the annual payment was actually increased. So the installments that they had to pay the money in was increased per year. All foreign control over reparations was ended, and it was now the total responsibility of the German government. In return, Britain and France withdrew their troops from the Rhineland in 1930, which is the yellow highlighted section of Germany you can see behind me on the map. And Germany was involved in the negotiations for the very first time. And also it was intended as a final settlement of the reparations issue. So how does this compare then to the Dawes Plan? And given the opposition to that in 1924, how do you think the Germans reacted to the Young Plan? Well, as you can guess, the nationalist reaction was to heavily criticize the plan. And despite containing a number of concessions to Germany, the Young Plan nevertheless inflamed this national opposition in Germany. And the new leader of the DNVP, Alfred Hugenberg, alongside other conservative groups, including the Nazis, actually launched a nationwide campaign against the plan. Now, Hugenberg had been a civil servant and then a banker before the war, and you can see him highlighted in the little red circle behind me. He owned newspapers and film companies, and as well as being a deputy in the Reichstag, representing the conservative DNVP. After he became leader of the party in 1928, it became more extreme in its hostility to the democratic government, and his money and media influence actually provided crucial support for the campaign against the Young Plan. In 1933, Hugenberg was appointed Minister for Economics and Food in the Nazi government, so you can see that he maintained his position throughout. Now, his campaign, going back a little bit, now his campaign group drew up the draft of a law, the so-called Freedom Law, which they demanded should be submitted to a national referendum. And the law required, remember, a referendum is a national vote across the country, so everyone has to participate in the vote for whether or not it goes ahead. And the law required the government to, firstly, repudiate the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles, to demand the immediate evacuation of the occupied areas, and thirdly, declared that any minister who signed a treaty that involved the acceptance of war guilt would be tried for treason. So incredibly harsh terms here. Now, Hugenberg's group launched a petition in support of their freedom law and attracted 4.135 million signatures. This was enough to ensure that it was debated by the Reichstag and put to a referendum. However, it was still decisively defeated and rejected in the referendum. But it is still important to note that, on the other hand, the fact that 5,825,000 voters, which is 13.8% of the electorate, actually voted for the Freedom Law, and this was an indication of the depth of support for right-wing nationalism. Moreover, Adolf Hitler's leading role in the campaign, which was financed by Hugenberg, enabled him to make a decisive breakthrough as a national political figure.